In the YouTube algorithm, the people are represented by two opposing groups: the reactionary content creators and the leftists who debunk them. These are their stories. Whew. So I think we've exhausted the wellspring of knowledge that is Brett Weinstein and Jordan Peterson's medical takes. So let's proceed. Let's hear what they have to say about communities in the internet.
Well, I think there are two different questions. The slavery issue is the very uncomfortable idea that if a parent is supposed to mirror the adult environment that a child will have to get along in, then a person whose children will mature into an arbitrary environment needs to understand that it's an arbitrary environment rather than being protected from it, right? In order to properly avoid running afoul of the arbitrary authorities in a slave environment, one has to be developmentally brought into how you navigate below the radar, how you play that game. And so anyway, you would expect the parenting to look very different. And, this idea that childhood is, a joyous time where you should be free of all of those adult influences is exactly wrong. It's preparation.
What's interesting here is some broad swaths of agreement. Initially, my initial agreement would be to say that, of course, when you're bringing up a child or when you're dealing with a new life in an arbitrary environment, you need to be able to teach that child that, yo, this is what the rules are of the game. I think, interestingly enough, I'm surprised to hear this coming from Brett Weinstein because for me, that line that he mentioned about people saying that childhood should be a free time, and he believes that no, you should be preparing a child for later life. Ironically enough, right, this is not something I hear very much from, how do I phrase this? I'm imagining that Brett Weinstein's kids probably don't need to hear that the world is a rough and awful place until maybe they're about 15, 16, you know? But I don't know if you are born poor. If you're, let's say, born poorer than Brett Weinstein and closer to looking like me than him, I can imagine that those lessons will come in a bit more handy than they might otherwise. But largely, we agree, Brett. Thus far. Thus far.
Though now, if we take this model that I think you and I are agreeing on here about the fact that and I like your point here, that there are three stages. You've got, I assert my identity independent of the world, then the world and I negotiate over what my actual identity is, and then I'm not an apprentice anymore and I get to be who I am in the adult world, having been informed by that process. And you imagine that you've got generations now, one and a half of them maybe, for whom the online environment was so compelling and so much the source of most of their affirmation that its rules have become sacrosanct to them. And those rules really do look like, it's a childish world, right? You join some community of people, you tell them who you are. There are rules about them having to respect who you've told them. It is, if I say I'm Pocahontas, who are you to say I'm not, right? And
okay, before we hear Jordan's response to this, I also want to say that it started falling off the rails the longer he spoke about this particular thing. So I think one of the things about the online world is that, or rather just the world in general, is that process of negotiation of identity that he mentioned. I don't think Brett Weinstein spends enough time in the online world if he thinks that your identity is broadly respected in the online world. Now, there is a smaller, I imagine the point that they're going to try to make going forward is that given that certain communities, once you join that community, the expectation by other members in that community is to respect you in that way. And that somewhat dilutes the initial negotiation process of identity. But yo, that never ends. That never ends. When you engage with other human beings, that negotiating process of my identity never stops. Ever. Ever. It just so happens to be the case that in the online sphere, you'll find more people willing to affirm your initial identity without further requirements for negotiation. But it is extremely fallacious to say that the process does not occur online because it absolutely does. Absolutely does.
Respect who you've told them. It is, if I say I'm Pocahontas, who are you to say I'm not, right? And that in some
Well, the
ways,
answer to that question in the real world is I'm someone you have to get along with in repeated interactions. But that may not be the case at all online. That
right, you
constraint's
may be able to,
gone.
you can just pick up and move to the next community.
And that's another
Um,
thing we should talk about, because another thing that's happening online is that I've detected this recently, is that the online environment is also making everyone acutely paranoid. And I think the reason for that is that it's easy for our thinking to go astray. And as we talked about earlier in this discussion, other people tap you back into shape. And you're surrounded by a kind of a random assortment of other people in the real world because you didn't select them. So because it's random, it provides you with what is in essence relatively unbiased feedback information.
So Jordan's response to Brett is to bring up the fact that in real life, you need to have repeated interactions with non-random members of a community, whatever that community might be. It might be a work community, it might just be the community you live in. In either way, you're sharing space with people that you did not select. And that process of having to share space with people you didn't select makes you have to engage the people around you in a way that you wouldn't otherwise. You have to engage in identities outside of your consideration. You have to engage in ideologies outside of your consideration. You have to do more than just exist for yourself, right? Good. Thus far we're agreed. And then the argument goes that this particular dynamic doesn't apply to the online world though, because in the online world, you effectively get to self-select a community that's going to be kind to you, that's going to respect your identity before you have to respect the identity of others. And then if your interactions in that community go south, then you just migrate to a new community and effectively you get to bypass that particular portion of having to socialize, having to engage as a social agent with other people and use that as a way to be able to grow. As Jordan mentions here, other people tap you back in line, put you back in order. This is insane. And the reason why it's insane is because how is the dynamic of moving on from a community that no longer engages with you in the way you want to in the digital world different than you just moving on from a friend group in the real world? It feels to me like the only way this argument makes sense to me, what they're saying now, is in the school and work context. In the school context or in the work context, you generally, I mean, you can, but generally you're going to be around those people for a lot longer portion of time. So you don't want to just move on at any given time. I mean, Jordan mentions that, in real life, you have these repeated interactions. You can't say that you have repeated interactions with people and then also say people are drawn to this online community that affirms them in a particular way, thereby telling us about a repeated interaction. Anybody who's spent any amount of time in any online space, in any online community, knows that the reason people go back to online spaces, the reason people go back to online communities, isn't just because I'm on a forum that everybody just happens to think the same as me. That's why I go there. The reason I stay there is because I find repeated interactions with random people I didn't select for, but with whom I happen to find rapport with. And losing those people hurts. It sucks. It's awful. Nobody, and y'all can correct me if I'm wrong. Somebody in the comment section, tell me about an online community they exist in right now where they don't have any close personal individual relationships with anybody in that community, and it's all just about circle jerk affirmation. There's no individuality, there's no direct relationship, there's no connection, and therefore there'd be no pain if you left. Somebody in chat, please tell me about an online community that if you left today wouldn't hurt. You wouldn't feel something. Hell, an online community where you haven't had to act better or change how you behave in the world in order to be able to ingratiate yourself in that community. I have no idea what I'm listening to right now. Actually, I know exactly what I'm listening to. Old white dudes who spend too much time on Twitter, but not enough time in like communities on the internet, if you know what I mean. That's what it feels like to me. Let's hear more.
But online, you can choose your compatriots. And it's likely to be the case that at your weakest point psychologically, you choose the least demanding compatriots. And so your craziest ideas are the least likely to be challenged.
damn it, sometimes the jokes just make themselves. So it does turn out to be the case that they, at the very least, when they're thinking about online community in this particular segment, they have in mind Twitter, maybe Facebook kind of interactions. The kind of interactions where you get to block people, you get to select whose feed you're gonna be engaging in, etc. Ultimately, yes, those are large swaths of the internet, or rather large silos of the internet. But in terms of the whole of how people engage in online communities, not just online communication, this would be very different if this was a post about social media, but this is specifically about online communities. And those online communities, yo, you do not always get to self-select all the people that are going to be in that community. You just simply do not. You simply do not have that luxury. You have to learn. It's just the same as any other interaction in the real world is. Got to learn what the rules on the ground are, the rules of the game in that space are, how people interact there, how people react there, what that space is, before you can try to put yourself in it and formulate it into what you think it should be. Either way, no. You do not get to self-select. I mean, honestly, if you could self-select who you engage with on the internet, so much drama and so much beef would just go away, evaporate tomorrow. So that's definitely not the case. However, there's something very interesting that he said next, which I will actually affirm and give agreement to. So he says that when you're looking for a community on the internet and you're selecting for people out there, you might find yourself in a position where the desire to do so in the first place comes from a place of deep vulnerability. You're vulnerable about something, you're going through a lot in your life, you might be in a place where there's no one in the real world left for you to turn to. He says that when you find yourself in that vulnerable position, you will find yourself gravitating towards those who demand the least of you, which is true. People who demand the least of you. However, there's a counterpoint to that. And I imagine there's a good reason why he doesn't want to bring up the counterpoint, given the path to his current fame. The counterpoint is that sometimes you'll find yourself falling in with people who demand everything of you, who will tell you how you're nothing. In your current state, you're worthless, useless, might not use those exact words, but they'll tell you that we have the path, we have the way, not just to your salvation, but to an end of your vulnerability. We hold the secrets to your strength. All you have to do is go to your nearest bookstore and order a copy of 12 Rules for Life, and then you're going to be the best version of yourself ever.
If you give me a choice between a community that believes everything I believe and one in which people believe very different things, I'm not going to choose the one in which people believe the things I believe, because for one thing, it's the end of growth and it's deathly boring.
I want to object slightly.
Okay.
I've had, and you've had this experience too. I've had the experience of being in an environment where a very large number of people don't agree with me vociferously. And what I would say is a little of that goes a long way.
I'm glad Jordan has a sense of humor. Lol. Oh man. Yeah, a little of that can go a long way. Yo, listen, I've been in rooms before. Now this was a much younger and much more cringy version of myself. But I've been in rooms, like large rooms, where there's dozens and dozens, close to 100, maybe not the same scale as Jordan, but dozens and dozens of people around you, you know, saying one thing to you and you're like, oh, you're wrong. It's exactly the opposite, something else completely. I will give him that indeed a little of that can go a long way. It's not the most fun thing in the world, but I deeply reject the assertion from Brett Dark Horse IDW Weinstein telling us that he doesn't want to belong to communities that already echo and share his beliefs. Cool story, bro.
Even if you're someone who wants to be able to tolerate dissent, there's a limited amount of dissent that you actually can tolerate. You are going to seek out an environment where most people agree with you, but some people don't some of the time. And it's kind of like listening to music. you'll like music that's optimally different from what you are enjoying right now, right? If it's exactly the same, it's boring. If it's too different, you can't hear it. There's an amount of novelty that you can tolerate, but it's not that large. And so even people who have been trained to look for evidence that disproves their own theories, they're only going to be able to tolerate a tiny bit of that at a time. It's too destabilizing.
Broad points of agreement here with Jordan Peterson. I have absolutely nothing to add to what he said. He is completely correct that you try it out. See how difficult it is to actually deal with, engage with, internalize ideas that are radically different from your own. Now, you can do it and you can engage those people, but you can almost never internalize what they're saying. You can digest it, but it's still, it's a foreign thing to you. You can always recognize that this is different from what your normal conception is. Interestingly enough, what he mentioned there about how you want to find something whose novelty is slightly outside of the band of acceptable, that's how change happens in our minds. You just keep pushing yourself slowly but surely into new ideas, new concepts, new ways of thinking. And before you know it, you look back and you're like, wow, I've covered a pretty large distance. However, what's interesting is that whenever you look back, it's very rare that when you've gone through a big change, that the previous version of yourself seems legit. The previous version of yourself always seems like, wow, I have no idea why I stayed in that stagnant place for so long. I should have been growing the entire time. I should have been expanding the entire time. And in fact, what looked to me back then as normal, I now see as outside of my tolerable bounds of novelty. So I'm completely okay with this argument from Jordan. And this is why it's also very important to engage things that you disagree with as often as you can, so that you push your novelty bounds as far apart as humanly possible. So you're able to deal with and internalize all these different ideas. But you will always have a center, and that'll make it difficult for certain things for you to engage with. And that's acceptable. That's fine. I'm okay with Jordan saying this. This is cool. I'm fine.
It's too destabilizing.
Well, all right. So I want to link this back up to what you said before about the 3 stages.
Yeah.
So my experience as a scientist is that my most valuable characteristic is the ability to be completely indifferent to the prevailing wisdom on a given point, right? And I think this is
No personal stake in it.
And that's BS. That's BS. That's insane. Yo, there is no scientist. There is no scientist that is completely indifferent to the prevailing zeitgeist in the industry and in the field. There literally is none. It is not possible to do. In order to be able to make any progress, you have to, in some sense, be guided by the prevailing orthodoxy. Even if you want to deviate from the prevailing orthodoxy, it is nonetheless the prevailing orthodoxy by which you're deviating from. No, this is... Like, I just want you to think about the idea of a scientist stepping into the lab and saying to himself, I'm throwing out everything that came before me and we're just working on what's come today. We're working on, I have this pet project, I have this pet notion, and I will literally not care as to how this relates to the prevailing orthodoxy at the time. This is not to say orthodoxies are correct or orthodoxies are necessarily good. This is just to say the idea that you operate completely free from their influence in a science field, insane. And of course, not to forget what happens to you internally once you come across a part of research that you want to engage in. He's trying to play this entire thing off as a scientist, you can actually sit on this far perch and just evaluate the evidence as needs be. But as Jordan already pointed out, even as someone whose job it is to do that, there's a degree which you can't go beyond. If you're a scientist and you have a pet theory or a pet formulation that you want to get pushed through, or that you think is going to help us expand our understanding of a particular subject, you're not going to let that go unless there's a very good reason. Other people, you're not going to let that go yourself. Other people are going to have to come to you with reams of evidence to prove why this is no longer a useful avenue of consideration. Even if that evidence was available to you the entire time, it took that external thing to happen. And the reason it took that external thing is because you have this internal part of yourself that cares deeply about the subject. This is your thing now. This is your thing now. And it's my thing now. and I become emotionally attached to my thing ahead of my intellectual responsibilities to the field.
Well, I may even have a personal stake. I may come up with an idea that compels me that it's probably right, a hypothesis.
Yeah.
And I may advance it and have every single one of my peers say, that's garbage. And my sense is not one of, oh crap, I've said something bad. My sense is, well, wouldn't that be delightful? If I'm as right as I think I am, then the fact that everybody else doesn't get this makes it even better, right? So my point is,
all right, so now we see where this all comes from. Now we see what this is all about. This is all about Brett just being able to prove I'm smarter than everybody else. So that the hope here, just from the way he's phrasing it, right? The hope isn't necessarily to advance knowledge or to internalize critique or to use that critique to build better knowledge. But think about how he phrased it. If I'm as right as I think I am, not as right as I've demonstrated, not as right as I've been able to show within argument with the people that are coming to me, I'm probably more right than y'all, so screw y'all. So if that's what it's about for you, my G, it is what it is. But you still have not demonstrated that you don't care about and you don't internalize the orthodoxy. You just simply demonstrated that all you care about is instituting your own.
So my point is, that's not normal. I know that's not normal, and it's not normal for evolutionary reasons that are easy to understand.
No, it takes a lot of training to accomplish that.
Yes, or a developmental environment that rewards it, right?
Sure.
If you have the right experience.
But then again, you said yourself, again, at the beginning of this conversation, think about the preconditions for that is that in order to open yourself up to that sort of criticism, you have to be supported in all sorts of ways, and even so when I'm functioning as a scientist, I am trying to disprove my presuppositions. I'll test them. It's like something manifests itself in an experiment. Then I design 3 or 4 experiments to see if I can make that effect go away. And I do that because I don't want to propagate nonsense and I don't want to pursue nonsense in my own career. But in order to tolerate that, think about how we set up the system is you have to be a tenured professor to do science or have the equivalent position in a research lab. But your economic situation is stabilized. Your social status is stabilized. Like you're protected on 50 fronts. And then you can open the door and say, okay, let's have some novelty come my way. And that's assuming that you're at a point where you can tolerate any novelty at all.
Another broad place of agreement here that if you are in a position where everything in your life is taken care of, there's a quote I heard once, which I think somewhat expresses a sentiment that is coming through here, which was that if you're in a position that your home life is safe, solid, secure, stable, then you should do everything in your power to make your outdoor life in the wider world as exciting as humanly possible. Vice versa might not always be the case because exciting home life ain't always the best, but you get the idea. The idea is that when you have that safety, there's a place for you to retreat to where you're taken care of properly that opens up enough extra space for you to be able to explore and to be able to make genuine headway without direct concern for yourself.
And that's assuming that you're at a point where you can tolerate any novelty at all. And more curious, more open, more emotionally stable, more intelligent people are more compelled by novelty and can handle it better, but still our ability to handle it is pretty low, and we will find environments that mostly reflect back to us what we want, most comforting.
Another place we can largely agree that we all have our predilections, we all have our particular proclivities that draw us in certain directions. So that just is what it is. And that's also one of the reasons why that requires introspection. It's a different project entirely. I'm not going to go into it today, but surprising amount of agreement today with Jordan Peterson, especially how we started. My God.
I wonder if there's not effectively a budget for discordant interactions. And, if we go back to what we were speaking about at the beginning of the conversation, the fact that not only do Heather and I have a great relationship, but we also speak the same language scientifically. So, it's a kind of across the board sounding board and ability to, I feel no vulnerability there because there's no place where our worldviews aren't compatible. And, you know, I could say similar things about Eric. So what that means is that my budget for discordant interaction is probably larger when I get to the outside world, um, because I haven't spent it at home or in the context of family or friends.
This is actually interesting that he somewhat actually goes into what we were just speaking about, how there must be this push-pull dynamic depending on how your life is externally and internally. But ironically enough, he's countermanding his own point from earlier about how much of a maverick he effectively is. Both how much of a maverick he is and how much he desires spaces that don't conform to his worldview, when everything he's saying is, hey, I really like being in spaces that conform to my worldview. It is what it is. I can't even write him too much about this one. It's just a normal human tendency. We're all out here. We all do this thing.
You produce a unit of psychophysiological preparation for every unit of uncertainty. And the size of that unit of expenditure varies with your trait neuroticism, because that's like evolution's guess at how dangerous the environment would be. It varies with your position in the social hierarchy, because if you're at the top where you're protected, the consequence of an error is attenuated compared to what it would be at the bottom. And that's why social position modulates serotonergic output. So the higher you are in the hierarchy, the more serotonin dampens your negative emotion to uncertain events.
Cut it off there for now. So he's talking now about any kind of situation where you might encounter uncertainty. Whether that uncertainty is due to interpersonal uncertainty in the cause of a disagreement or societal uncertainty. Whatever the case might be, that uncertainty, your body prepares itself for dealing with it. And there's a greater amount of preparation necessary to deal with uncertainty the lower you are on any kind of social hierarchy, because there's more at stake. There's more to lose, effectively. He almost tripped up and called it that stupid dominance hierarchy term of his. Largely, it was okay, I suppose. One of the big issues that I still find with Jordan Peterson, ultimately, is that he's not able to peel back the curtain far enough and see the underlying issue. Now, we're talking about these things in the context of online communities without us addressing what it is about the material world that has led to these communities seeming like such inviting spaces. Since the world in its current configuration is closer to Jordan's vision of the world than it is to many others, myself included, vision of the world, it must also be the case that Jordan, by design, has to lay any societal failures at individual feet. You can't go the opposite direction. You simply cannot. You can give reasons as to why individual people might make certain decisions, but you can't give societal level explanations, because to do so would collapse the internal logic of this hierarchy, because as he says, the hierarchy is the thing. The thing. This whole conversation was us getting to this hierarchy part, right? And about, consider when he was even explaining about how to deal with novelty, this attenuation of the serotonin reflex within your body, the fact that it is attenuated by your position on the hierarchy, and there's never going to be mentioned by him that this is a bad thing. The mention from him is going to be, no, this is good, in fact. And think of the language. Higher IQ people are better at problem solving. The more status you have, you can deal with these issues. He's fine with this. The entire project is to get you all to move further up the hierarchy such that you get the serotonin attenuation for negative emotions that you might be experiencing. Instead of using the knowledge that he's just expressed now about how one's position within the hierarchy attenuates effectively your stress responses, I would want to say, let us figure out ways to dismantle that hierarchy such that everybody might be able to access the low stress response to negative emotional stimuli. His response might be, well, no, if you're at the bottom, we'll figure out how to get you to the top. Instead of, let's try to create a world where there isn't that top or bottom. And ultimately, for me, this is always going to be my issue with Jordan Peterson. No matter how useful I might sometimes find his diagnostic work, his prescriptive work towards a society of dominance hierarchies is one that I simply cannot abide by, simply can't endorse. In this video, he was more or less endorsing it, but at the very least, he was coherent, not insane, like when you're talking about medicine. So it is what it is. I would have liked to hear more from Jordan about how this dominant hierarchy, I'm going to keep using that term, by the way, because that's the term he wants to use. So we're going to keep using it. I want to hear more from him about why this is the preferable arrangement. This is always going to be my issue with Jordan. He's always very well able to articulate and describe the diagnostic nature of several things. Not all things, well, several things. He's able to accurately, he had a conversation with Slavoj Žižek, and the two of them were able to come to not agreement, but there were several times Jordan was able to see sense and affirm in a sense that yes, he agrees with what Žižek is saying here. And often, diagnostically, he's able to do that. The main problem is that all of this diagnostic work from Jordan Peterson is ultimately in service of prescribing a world with steeper dominant hierarchies rather than flatter. And ultimately, that's going to mean that that's a world I can't vibe with. And he also never really gets into articulating why that vision of the world is the best vision of the world outside of just saying, well, these hierarchies exist now, which is ultimately not really a convincing argument. Telling me how the world is rather than how the world should be, ultimately I have the wrong temperament and honestly the wrong skin color to be satisfied with any answer that doesn't tell me about how the world should change for the better. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. Make sure that you are mashing that subscribe button. Give this video a thumbs up. And if you enjoy what you heard, consider supporting the work through Patreon or PayPal. Description will be in the comment section down below. As always, I'm your host, Sean. This is Curve Thought, and I will see you in the next video.